Are you tired of listening to German language all day long?
Don't you just want to get your news and topics presented in English, even though you live in Germany?
Then here's your solution.
Elephant in the Room, an English radio show where we discuss things that people tend to ignore.
Tune in on Color Radio on 99.3 and 98.4 every second and fourth Monday of the month.
Elephant in the Room, a radio show by the Black Rose Radio Collective from Dresden.
Hate Mondays. Be organized. Stay cool.
Hello and welcome to our today's radio show here by Elephant in the Room on Color Radio from Dresden. Today we are gonna talk about Iran. This year Iran is facing already several kind of waves of protest, and we will give it a closer look. First, in the first part of the show, we're gonna read a letter to you of imprisoned women, and in the second part we are having an interview with the translator of the Anarchist Union of Iran and Afghanistan, who is giving us the anarchist perspective on the recent protest in Iran.
This is Color Radio on 98.4 and 99.3 FM in Dresden and stream.colorradio.org worldwide. You're listening to Color Radio.
Sanctions by the United States and the European Union, coupled with economic mismanagement, have led to severe economic crisis in Iran in the past few years. And this leads to some reaction by the population and the workers. And we saw actually in the last years a lot of protests and uprising in Iran. Also in 2019, this year, there were already several attempts and waves of protest. And we would like to have a closer look on the May Day protest and the results of that. The prolonged May Day in Iran hasn't finished yet. This year, in the consequences of the ever-worsening financial situation in the country, a group of workers, students and activists gathered in front of the parliament of May 1st to raise their voices about the issues related to the hard lives of the wage earners, disastrous rate of unemployment and precarious working condition, and the suppression of working-class protest. The gathered faced violent intervention of the police and dozens were arrested. Some were released during the next days and weeks, but a few are still in prison. Neda Nei, along with 14 other female labor activists, were arrested during the Labor Day protest on May 1st in Tehran, in front of the mullah's parliament. Marsi Amiri, the Iranian journalist, received a 10-year jail sentence. And together with Neda Nei and two other activists, who has also been arrested for supporting workers and reflecting their struggle in the media, wrote together a letter in September 2019 to address the activists and the civil society. The full text of the letter, written by the four female activists, we're going to read now. Making a living has become the biggest concern of wage earners. On the one hand, we have the corrupt, the embezzler, and the swindler enriching themselves. On the other hand, the inhuman sanctions of the world economic leaders. Both are making the life of the working class harder. The subaltern in an unequal struggle for finding and keeping jobs and also receiving their back pay, try to protect their small assets against the owners of power and wealth. The protests of the Half-Tapeh sugarcane factory workers were example of these struggles, which was based on workers' justified demands. These protests reflected the workers' cry for their subsistence and were out of pain. They were protesting the situation that has more or less brought all of the wage earners, including us, on knees to a dead end. As part of this society that has been affected by the economic situation, who found the workers' demands as ours and we supported them. But the reaction of security forces with the worker and their supporters with the excuse of fighting a national threat was too extreme and harsher than before, which led to long-lasting arrests. Having to undergo solitary confinement even after the interrogation phase, transferring our sisters Atifi Rangris and Sepide Golian to Kharkak prison, the extra punishment or exile, issuing heavy 2 billion toman bail and not implementing it, and finally the heavy sentences. In a purely unfair process and without any attention to the defenses of our lawyers and ourselves, and only based on the case executives, the Revolutionary Court issued heavy sentences of 10.5 to 18 years. While Neda Nai, one of the detainees of Labour Day protest, is still awaiting trial. Being jailed and facing heavy sentences put on the verge of collapse everything that we had tried for all our lives. Loves that faced separation, studies left unfinished, houses and jobs that were lost, and bodies that were dwindled. And then came the tears of mothers who were waiting for justice. But what makes this pain worse is how they are favoring the embezzler and the corrupt over the social activists and journalists in front of law. This discrimination makes one lose all hopes of justice and forces them to gamble on his life when he's facing the court. Although we have seen only injustice up to now, despite our lengthy temporary detention and the probability of facing oppressive and unjust sentences teases our souls, but the passions for life, the desires for freedom, and the joy of being with our loved ones, full our moments with hope. Like our brothers and sisters, we seek equality and have been spending the dark days of prison with the same hope. Our voice that was pleading for justice from the judicial system provoked a lot of reactions, including the reaction of the head of the system that called for a fair inquiry of the verdict that was submitted by 28th branch of Revolutionary Court. Your call for justice is not only shed a light of hope in our hearts, but in the hearts of all those who are unfairly imprisoned. Our relief is in the continuance of the call that is coming from the bottom of the society demanding justice, and we hope that hearing this call by the judicial executive would lead to a fair judgment. Your devotion to the truth of your efforts to the unconditional release of us is heartwarming. Evin Prison, September 2019. The labor activist Neda Nai was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison for participation in the Labor Day protests in Tehran. And the verdict for her was issued on December 3, 2019, so last week, after 218 days of detention under undetermined conditions.
Strip malls full of cancer and a pathetic rain. Lover, sweet lover, please don't discipline your hands.
Okay, so we are today having a guest on the line, so not in the studio, in the internet. He's a translator for the Anarchist Union of Afghanistan and Iran. Welcome. And we are
Hello.
going... Hey. And we are going to talk a little bit about Iran in the context of the recent protest. I think some people already heard what is going on there, also heard about the death of the protesters, but I would like to start somewhere a little bit earlier, before the protests. Can you describe a little bit the situation that actually led to the protests, so the economical, social, and political setup?
Of course, sure. Taking us a little bit back, as early as the 90s, there have been protests and riots against the Iranian regime. So in July of 1999, there were the Iranian student protests, which lasted for 6 days in large cities like Tehran and Isfahan. And there are many people who were killed or wounded by the regime. After that, it was about a decade later in 2009 when there was the Green Movement, which lasted about 9 months until the regime was able to suppress it. More recently, starting in 2017, beginning on December 28, there were a series of protests against the regime that happened in over 150 cities across Iran. This sort of expanded into general strikes and protests throughout 2018, because in Iran, the economic situation has been very poor. We know from the state, the regime, the Central Bank of Iran reports that 50% of Iranians are below the relative poverty line, and that was in 2015. So we can only speculate at how many people are impoverished today, 4 years later, considering the amount of inflation and that the economic situation has not gotten better. And then just before the protests, in March, the minimum wage was set in March 21st, 2019, which is Nowruz, which is the beginning of the new year in the Persian calendar. And the minimum wage was set at about 15 million riyals a year, which is a fifth of what labor activists in Iran say it should be to have a livable wage. And when it was set in March, 15 million a year is equivalent to about $135 American. But due to inflation, now it's worth about $30 a month. So they're a very dire economic situation and a very oppressive situation for social movements.
And can you describe a little bit what was actually the reason for the protest? How did it start, and how did it spread all around the country?
Earlier in November, there were rumors that there would be some price increases for fuel, that they would cut subsidies, and a small group of elites in Iran made the decision to decrease the fuel subsidies. So originally, people were paying about 8 cents a liter for the first 250 liters of fuel, and they decreased that. So people then had to pay 12 cents a liter for 60 liters of fuel, and then 26 cents per liter after that. And since people are not making much money a month, this further sort of economic strain on just their sort of day-to-day living sort of sparked the new waves of protests. I think some of the hottest spots for the protests on the first day were Mashhad, which is in the northeast of the country, and as well as Ahwaz in Khuzestan province, which is in the west. But within a few hours, these protests had spread to over 100 cities across Iran, including Tehran. Several suburbs of Tehran were protesting as well.
Taking account that the protest started with the question of prices on fuel, how did the political demands or social demands of the protesters change during this period of protest? Does it stay still at the question of the prices, or it went further?
So it did go further than fuel prices. The regime announced a couple of days later during the protests that they would be offering a program to help poor people pay for the fuel prices. We're not exactly sure when this decision was made, so before this was announced or after the protests started. I mean, there's no reason to think that if they'd made this decision beforehand, they would have announced it when they announced cutting the subsidies. The protests quickly escalated to attacking the economic representations of the regime. So hundreds of banks were burned in Iran. However, this evolved into sort of a blanket call for an overthrow of the regime. People attacked and burned police stations. There were over 50 military outposts that were attacked as well. There were posters of the supreme leader, Khamenei, torn down throughout Iran as well. So it took an aim both at the economic situation as well as the state itself.
All right. And can you present a little bit to the people if there are certain political powers that are in opposition to the government? Because as we see from here outside of Iran, the situation is pretty repressive. It's hard to maintain the political work or something like that. Is there something going on in that direction, or the current protests are more spontaneous and there is not so much of a political organization behind it?
So over the past few years, including the sort of 2017 protests that I mentioned, most of the protesters have not had any sort of political affiliation. It is very much spontaneous. They're responding to their own material conditions, their economic conditions, their political conditions. In the west of the country, which is primarily like Kurdish region, and the PJAK party, which is an Iranian Kurdish party affiliated with the PKK and the PYD in Turkey and in northern Syria. They have contributed to some of the political organization in that part of the region, though there are an increasing numbers of anarchists, and anarchists have been participating in the street movements and in combating the police and the Revolutionary Guard.
Okay. Islam is also playing quite an important role in Iran. Mm-hmm. However, as I know from the protests that were happening in the other parts of the Arab world or in the other parts of the world in general, certain religious leaders sometimes tend to actually switch sides. Is there something like that going on in Iran, or actually the religious institute is pretty consolidated?
So of course the regime, the revolutionary regime, has many ayatollahs and clerics on their side. Some of them have been calling for torture and mutilation to be used against arrested protesters. However, there is also the assembly of the activist clerics under I guess what most English-speaking political commentators call the moderates, which Rouhani would belong to. And there are also opposition clerics who belong to the political opposition in Iran, who have been condemning the regime and its treatment of protesters.
All right. You were also mentioning that the protest started because of the economical problems in the country. However, what are the social parts of the society that are participating now in the protest? Is that only people who are at the very bottom of the society, or the other parts are also participating in this?
In some ways, it's difficult to separate the top from the bottom of society because, again, over 50% of the population lives in poverty. But we see an alliance between, poor working people as well as students and educated people and other workers as well. There have been many strikes in Iran, general strikes across the country. Many workers go without pay oftentimes because either the government or their companies can't afford to pay them. So it is really a broad popular movement. However, that's not to say that there aren't segments of the population who don't support the Revolutionary Guard, and there are those who support the Islamic Republic and the Revolutionary Guard across society as well. After the end of the protests and they had been suppressed on November 20th, there were pro-government protests that happened. So while these protests are very popular and you see a cross segment of society between the poor, workers, students, and educated people, coming out to oppose the government, the American sanctions, and the government's economic policy and the current situation there.
With current internet blockade, how do people manage to communicate? Of course, it's kind of an obvious question for the people who are not using internet or not using it really intensively. But I think for a lot of activists from the West, internet became the main platform for organizing. What are the alternatives right now for the people?
There have been Iranian activists who are using, alternative networking solutions on their phones. So they have been networking their phones together as ways to communicate. So creating internet through protesters' devices instead of using the the regime's internet, which had been blocked. In certain places, they're able to access the internet either of other nearby countries or through satellite phones and those sorts of things. They've been able to access the internet that way, but a lot of the communication that was happening on the ground would have been local. And this has been a bit of a problem for getting out information and also video of the regime's atrocities and repression, because many people have been killed. There have been some estimates from Western NGOs of a few hundred people. However, our own estimates are much higher, maybe as many as 1,000 people. but we're not entirely sure because there's been a lot of repression of information. Many bodies of dead protesters are being kept by the regime, and if people want their dead loved ones back, they have to pay what has been called the bullet tax, which has been around at least for a decade. And this essentially involves the government charging the families of protesters who have been killed by security forces to sort of pay for that death to get their loved one back. And they're not allowed to publicly mourn during that period, so they can't have funerals or burials or put up traditional mourning shrouds at their home.
And what is the current situation inside of Iran with the protests going down? What is happening to the people who were participating in the protests and got arrested, or the people who are actually now, well, hunted by the government?
So, as I said, so far there are over 200 confirmed deaths, but there are estimates for more, maybe over 1,000. And there have been many more people who have been injured. We're not really clear about the exact number of people who are injured because many felt they could not go to hospitals because they feared being arrested or detained. The regime in Iran claims that over 7,000 people have been arrested, though the estimates are much higher. And we know that schools during the protests were used as temporary prisons for people. And the regime itself has killed at least 13 children, people who are between the ages of 14 and 18 who are participating in the protests. I think one of the most prominent was Nikta Esfahani. I think she was the most well known, and she was killed on November 16th in Tehran. And also, there were refugees who participated in the protests who have been killed. So there were 9 Afghan refugees who were killed, and over 120 Afghan refugees have also been imprisoned. So in addition to targeting Iranian civilians, they're also targeting refugees. The response to the protests by the government have included things like demands for protesters to face the death penalty. The leader of the Revolutionary Guard, Hossein Salami, he has demanded that. And Khamenei, he, after the protest, has been blaming the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's very important for the regime to blame these protests on foreign actors. And that sort of feeds into certain narratives about foreign coups and that have been floating around the internet. And Rouhani, Hassan Rouhani, he has called for innocent protesters to be released. And by that, he means protesters who were arrested without being armed. So people who are just on the streets protesting, though, again, we're not sure how many people that would be, or even if the state would do that. I think many people know about the internet blockage that happened, how the internet was shut down across Iran. But the internet, as of today, is still shut down in the province of Sistan and Balochistan. The Baloch people in Iran, as a nation, they are split between Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. And both secular as well as Sunni, like Islamist militants, have been fighting against the Iranian government for quite some time, though many of the secular leaders have been forced to flee because they were targeted by the Iranian state. So they still do not have internet, even now. And the state throughout the protests had also been denying that anyone was being killed, even though there were videos that were making it through the sort of internet blackout that showed Revolutionary Guard and police shooting Iranians, civilians. The state TV, after the fact, did say that state forces had killed rioters. And in many cases, they're framing the protesters as rioters and thugs and foreign-backed agents, claiming that they arrested several CIA agents in Iran, instead of talking about them as just normal Iranians who are rising up against political repression. So it's we're not entirely sure about everything that is happening right now because information is still not clear, and there's a lot of repression, and the information being let out by the state is not entirely reliable, and not all of our comrades are in communication, but we are sure that this is a very tense situation, and if the Iranian regime makes a misstep, makes another mistake, the protests could flare up again.
Is there any consequences for the families of those who were arrested? As it happens in other places in the world, the government is putting collective responsibility on the families and friends of the protesters.
Yes. So oftentimes the families are economically responsible for protesters who are died or who are captured. They have to pay for the release of the bodies, or they have to bribe to get their family members out. We know from sort of the widespread political repression, political prisoners in Iran, their families are often put under a lot of pressure. Sometimes their family members are also arrested, especially if they try to create a lot of publicity about the political arrest. They can also be silenced by being put on house arrest or being thrown in prison as well. So there are political repercussions as well as economic repercussions for the families of those who participate in the protests.
For me, what is also interesting, as you are kind of talking for the Anarchist Union, what is the role of the anarchists in those protests? How people are actually getting connected to the anarchism, and what is the attitude inside of Iran towards those ideas in general?
Okay. So since 2016, many younger people were originally in favor of reform and reforming the government. But now most of the conversation that we see, especially online, is targeted around overthrowing the regime and opposition to the regime. So we're seeing that the repression to the younger generation as they're growing up, they are experiencing struggles that are turning them towards anarchism. And through our own polls that we've run online, we can see that anarchism is growing in popularity on the streets and in organizing. Anarchists have been responsible for organizing many of the protests over the past few years, and have also been directly participating in them. And that has been a way to bring people in and bring people towards anarchism within Iran. Though what is very important is translating many materials and getting information about anarchism to Iranians, because there isn't much linguistic sort of cross communication between a lot of English speakers, French speakers, German speakers, and Italian speakers, and Farsi speakers. And since a lot of anarchism and anarchist theory has grown in a lot of European languages, getting that conversation and getting those texts translated is very important to sort of spread and nurture sort of the growing anarchist movement.
All right. What is also kind of important for me to understand the situation is actually the question of how big is the chance of the success? How big is the possibility that the regime will go down after all the blood that was spilled? And do you see any institutions of power that have failed due to the protests in the last weeks? And also some of the institutions that might collapse due to the protests, bringing down the regime down?
At a local level, through infrastructure, the economic system, the institution of the bank has been severely damaged because hundreds of their branches were burned across the country. It's going to be very difficult for the Bank of Iran to engage with the populace as they did before until they find new places to have their branches. There has been an erosion of trust in the police, in the military, in the Revolutionary Guard, and hundreds of military and police vehicles were burned. We can see in those acts of protest, in the demonstrations, that there is a breach in the trust that a lot of Iranians had for the government that has been growing over time. And in many cases, not just trust, but there may have been an acquiescence that if the state provides certain things, you should at least live quietly and not complain. But now at this point, there's no faith in the state and state institutions. So far, no institution has crumbled. And after 5 days, the state had succeeded in suppressing the protests. However, we believe that they could erupt again at any time. There are many conversations right now online about speaking about armed struggle and engaging in armed struggle. And the Anarchist Union of Afghanistan and Iran issued a communique that was translated into English as well, agreeing to work with armed opposition. And that includes the armed opposition of minority groups, such as the Kurdish and the Arab and the Baloch, groups. Because in certain parts of Iran, there are ongoing insurgencies led by minority armed opposition groups.
Right. I've heard that the government was also using the militaries to suppress the protests. Was there any kind of, how would you say, opposition inside of the military powers to say we're not going to kill our fellow human beings and so on and so forth?
Not that I'm aware of. And we also have to, in Iran, there's sort of two security apparatus in addition to the police. There's the Revolutionary Guard as well as the military, and the Revolutionary Guard, has its own air force. They have their own foreign service. They have their own infantry. They have their own volunteer units as well. So both of these were sort of participating, though the Revolutionary Guard is often used to quell protests. And they had a very large role in shutting down the 2017 protests as well.
Okay, so the last question for me would be, what is what are the ways that people outside can help the people in Iran, somehow support the anti-government movement and actually bring some kind of changes also from outside?
Speaking purely about information is very important, of course, that American sanctions are opposed because the American sanctions on the economy of Iran are hurting the people there and are making their lives more difficult. However, in addition to opposing American imperialism, we also have to oppose the Iranian state. And it's very important for us as anarchists to do that. There are other parts of the left, if we'd like to call them that, who have been supporting Iran, and they support the Iranian government merely because the Americans are opposed to them. And this, both ignores the domestic situation of living under an oppressive government that Iranian people are going through, as well as and not giving agency to the people of Iran who are demonstrating and protesting. We see online many situations of people saying that this is a color revolution or that these people are CIA operatives. And this is not the case. And these sorts of ideas that this is a foreign-backed protest movement need to be opposed, because the people who live in Iran are suffering. They're suffering from both the Iranian government and American sanctions. And, we have to support their struggle against both of those things. We can't focus on one without the other. There was a call to assist in bringing resources in case there are further protests and demonstrations where funding would be needed for medical resources. Though when that time comes, there will be ways to, provide monetarily for those things.
All right. Thanks a lot for this interview. Thanks a lot for information that you gave us. We send solidarity to the struggle in Iran, and hope that the fuckers will go down and the people will prevail.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on and allowing me to talk about the struggles that have going on in Iran that the local people face.
California, part of this country, United States of the world, and all their billionaires, if money could buy happiness and love, they will have it. But praise God, it's only salvation, it's only Jesus Christ. Holy hallelujah. It's only Jesus Christ. Can give us peace, happiness, and love, and God.